So let's go ahead and rationalize our supply base. It sounds pretty simple, and on the face of it, it is, but it can be complicated. So first we need to determine how many and which suppliers are needed, right? And then after we do that, we need to define the type of relationship that we should build. Are we just going to have a transactional relationship? Are we going to have a strategic alliance? Are we going to have a partnership? Are we going to have something else? We need to define that because that's going to lead us down different paths. So how many suppliers do we need? Do we need a single source or a multiple source? Well, a single source, we can create value, but the more we can have greater economies of scale with a single source. We also reduce costs, especially that administrative cost, because we're only managing one supplier. But on the other hand, we have higher costs when it comes to multiple sources. We have to learn about those different suppliers. And once we learn about those different suppliers, we can then get better prices because we can say, well, supplier A is doing this, and supplier B is doing this. Can you beat them? You can play them off each other. So some things that are going to influence your decision: the purchasing philosophy of the buyer. What is your purchasing philosophy? The technological sophistication of the item and the characteristics of the market. Is the market small? Is it large? Is it complicated? Is it simple? And then your supplier capabilities. Can they meet your demand? If you need more than a single supplier can provide, well, obviously you can't have just a single supplier, right? You need to look for more. So we have a case here for multiple suppliers. So we need to consider how we're going to avoid risk. If we have one supplier and for whatever reason they close, that's a huge risk. But if we have multiple suppliers and one closes, we still have other suppliers. There might be a little hiccup in the road. Access technology. Having multiple suppliers, we can get more possibilities. If we have one supplier, we're stuck with what they got. So that's another benefit of having multiple suppliers. We can drive learning. So learning how you individually can develop your learning when you work with different companies for the same item. You might be able to hone your negotiating skills. And multiple suppliers can also support global operations because your suppliers, you might have a supplier in China, you might have a supplier in India, a supplier in the United Kingdom, and the supplier in the United States. But your operation in China, well, you can use your Chinese supplier to provide to your Chinese operation. You don't have to send something from the United States to China when you can just have it made domestically in China and shipped to your operation. It could be so much easier that way, and it supports it much better. But on the other hand, we do have some cases of single sourcing. We can aggregate our purchases. So we can combine all our purchases into one supplier. And by doing that, we'll reduce administrative costs because you only need to do things once instead of 2, 3, 4 times. And then you can develop a relationship with specific assets. So knowing that, okay, they can produce this or they can provide this is going to be a great help because when you think of those items, you're going to think of that company. And so it's going to be easy for you. But we need to recognize that there's factors that influence our supply-based rationalization. So we need to see how technology complex is the item, how many qualified suppliers are there. If you're sourcing microchips, there's very few companies out there that can do it. But if you're sourcing pens, there's so many different suppliers out there. And then we have to understand our company's philosophy. We need to understand that. What is their strategic mission? What are their goals? Because those goals will kind of guide us in our purchasing. So what is the process of this rationalization for our supply base? Well, here it is on the screen. So we need to establish a strategic sourcing steering committee. So this could be, I mean, it might not be called this, but it might be 2 or 3 of you that get together and kind of define how you're going to do things. And set a time frame when you're going to do it, and then figure out how. So you need to establish a cross-functional commodity team. So you might want to involve the internal customer that you're sourcing this for. They might have some input. You might want to involve maybe another person who also sources this for your company. You know, I mean, a committee or a team doesn't have to be large. It could be small. The larger the team, the more bureaucratic things are going to get, and less dynamic, and the ability to change and go different directions is going to be hindered with the larger team. So you need to develop a commodity sourcing strategy. So how can you standardize things? Is there a way to aggregate your requisitions? What's your risk that you're going to be assessing, and the number of suppliers that you need to do that? If your risk assessment is unacceptable, you might need to get 2 or 3 suppliers instead of 1. That way you spread the risk out, which might make the risk acceptable then. So we need to identify and evaluate potential suppliers. So now we're actually looking at suppliers. And when we do that, we're going to look at our current suppliers and some new ones. We're going to evaluate the make versus buy decision. Do we want to bring this in-house? Do we want to insource it instead of outsourcing it? And then we need to examine our total order performance capabilities. So once we do all that, we need to basically select our supplier and build the relationship. We need to identify the relationship's intensity. Is it a transactional relationship? Is it a partnership? Is it a strategic alliance? Is it a collaboration? All these different areas. And then we need to implement these changes. So we need to manage supplier entrance and exit process. We need to transfer tooling if, for whatever reason, maybe we provided the stamps or the dies for the stamping of our products. We need to protect our intellectual property, especially if we're outsourcing to a foreign country. We don't want our products being made by other companies that are not authorized by us, because then now we have a lot of fakes out on the market, right? And then we need to phase in and out inventory. So if we're switching over to a supplier, we probably want to go ahead and get rid of our previous inventory to bring in that new inventory. And then we need to, of course, make reviews. And once we review and we see a potential negative, well, we need to talk to our supplier and see if they can adjust that and bring it in line with what we want. So we need to promote that improvement. So how do we select suppliers? Well, we have our list of potential suppliers, right? So we put out an RFP, a request for proposal. And then once we go through that, we're going to start doing some in-depth interviews based on the proposals we receive. But not everybody's going to get an interview. And after the interviews, we're going to go visit some plants, some manufacturing sites. But not everybody's going to make it to that stage. And then after we visit the plants, we're going to take a look at that. We're going to create a final agreement. So we're going to have our suppliers of choice, because we've went to their plant, and based on what they told us and what we saw, they may be the best ones for us. So we'll have that final agreement. It might be a form of a contract. It might be that they stay on a list that we can reach out to later. But that's, the selecting suppliers. I mean, we've gone over this a couple times throughout other topics. So hopefully you get it by now, how we do that. So that's it for this video. Let's go ahead and talk on supplier development. How do we take a supplier who may not be performing to the level we want and move them closer to what we want? And we do that through supplier development. So let's go ahead and move on to that video.